Now, obviously the best place to get your poetry advice is this show, but if you must supplement it with something in print, well, you probably couldn't do much better than this. My dear friends, welcome back to the show. We're approaching the end of Poetry Month and the end of an academic semester, and when it comes to teaching, I'm pretty textbook averse. It can be hard to justify the cost, and I'm also the kind of ego case who's convinced enough of his own approach to writing that I don't really see why I would let some other book speak for me. But there is one book that I've asked students to get more than once, and it's Ted Kooser's The Poetry Home Repair Manual. The first time I taught a poetry class, it was because I didn't have enough confidence in my own knowledge, so I figured students would take me more seriously if we had a book written by a former U.S. Poet Laureate to back me up. Since then, though, I've continued to assign it because it's just a great book. Kooser presents the book as advice for beginning poets, and I think if you're going to start anywhere, this is probably the best place to begin. But even if you aren't a beginner, Kooser's insights are relevant. Teaching from it again over the last few months, I've still come away with a better understanding of and appreciation for poetry. I mean, we'll get into it, but how can you not love a book that says at the top of page 1, you'll never be able to make a living writing poems? That's the real stuff, and it only gets better from there. The history of poetry and poetry reading, especially in our brave modern age, is riddled with exaggerated academic seriousness. We encounter poems in school, usually poems many generations older than our great-grandparents and written in strange, anachronistic forms of English. Then our teacher stares over the rim of their glasses and asks us, in that tangle of Victorian nonsense, not just to understand a sentence, but to produce discourse on what the poem really means. And of course, under those circumstances, it's no surprise that people turn away, assuming that poetry just isn't for them. Somewhere along the lines, poetry became an academic thing, a way for writers to flatter themselves and flatter the scholars who claim to be critics of literature, and a way for armchair intellectuals to flatter themselves for being willing to put up with all that esoteric bloviating while they present sophisticated readings of poems that have no functional connection to the texts themselves. And I may be exaggerating only a little, but these attitudes towards poetry are real and common. Lucky for us, though, they do not represent Kooser's approach to the art. Instead, Kooser is welcoming, and he broadens the appeal of poetry beyond those academic analyses. He cites poet and Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney in saying that a poet should be of service. Throughout the book, you'll see a refusal of that look at how smart I am academic approach to poetry, as Kooser embraces instead a humble, humane kind of poetry, a poetry that he says offers the gift of a refreshening of the world. And to back it up, the Poetry Home Repair Manual is full of examples from contemporary poets. You won't run into these and thous, hasts and goeths. There aren't any excruciating inversions of syntax or obscure classical references. Instead, he features poems that speak in everyday language of everyday things, like artichokes, goldfish, and snails. You don't need a master's degree to grasp these poems, and Kooser doesn't present them in a way that would get you one, because that's not the point. The goal here is not poetry as a subject of academic study, it's poetry as an art, a thing that human beings do independent of the academy. I think it's really unfortunate that we set up a great hurdle of poetry from distant times and places at the entryway for so many people. What would happen if instead we let people start with the poetry that speaks to their own experiences in their own language? Well, I think we'd end up with something like the work Kooser is doing here, a book that lowers barriers and gives aspiring poets a way into the real art of poetry, rather than the academic charade that so often accompanies it. I mentioned that Kooser argues that poets and poetry should be of service. For him, that clearly means writing poetry with readers in mind, and, of course, anything or anyone that urges a writer to think about the audience is going to make my rhetorician's heart sing a little tune. In the first chapter, Kooser, who, let me repeat, served as Poet Laureate of the United States and won a Pulitzer, says the finest compliment I've ever received came from a woman who had read a little poem of mine in which I describe a family of mice moving their nests out of a field to avoid a farmer's plow. And she said that she would never again pass a freshly plowed field in spring without thinking of those mice. For Kooser, the payoff is in affecting a reader, reaching another human being on the other side of a poem. And because of that, he dedicates the second chapter of the book to helping poets think about their readers. That's right, before we talk about imagery or metaphor or rhyme or other things like linguistic compression, line breaks, or prose poems, Kooser urges us to think about the people who will read our poetry. As he puts it, poetry is too good a thing to keep to oneself. A poem is meant to be shared with others. Poetry is a form of communication. It has something to say, and if it has something to say, it must have someone to say it to. Kooser doesn't wander into rhetorical theory the way this show so often does, but his point is a rhetorical one. Everything we do is or should be a function of our audience. And that's not to say that you just tell your audience whatever they want to hear. It means that if you want to make a meaningful connection with someone, to really communicate with them, you need to understand them enough to say something that will resonate with them. Poems written without readers in mind are journal entries written in verse. And there's nothing wrong with that, but writers who hope to be read need to think about the needs of the ones who will be doing the reading. Kooser compares a poem to a house guest. The existence of a poem is not enough to force someone to read it. Instead, your poem has to be the kind of house guest that merits an invitation in, and that makes good on the reader's gesture of trust. And this is probably what I love the most about this book. It starts with the reader in mind. When you know your reader and take your responsibility to that reader seriously, so many of the dangers of obscure, self-indulgent, or trite poetry can take care of themselves. That is, Kooser resists the move to make poetry all about technique or craft. Of course, he gets there, but he recognizes that poetry is about connecting people before it's about counting syllables or pulling off unexpected rhymes. Of course, it's not all high-level poetry vision statements either. With a title like the Poetry Home Repair Manual, you'd expect some practical techniques for repairing or constructing your own poetry at home. And that's exactly what we get here. Each chapter focuses on a different aspect of writing poetry, from dealing with feelings, selecting precise and evocative details, fine-tuning metaphors, and spinning your memories into meaningful poems. And at every step, Kooser provides accessible recommendations and engaging analogies to illustrate his points. For example, he explains that poets should carefully select the details they include in a poem in order to lead readers to the right understanding of the piece. And he illustrates that point by talking about how you might need to be more specific in describing a chicken so that a reader's previous experiences with chickens don't overshadow the experience you're trying to evoke. Again, it really comes down to the reader. Are they likely to get the point with a minimal description? Great. But if not, be selective in your detail to lead your reader where you need them to be. Or on metaphors and similes, Kooser points out that they should be used to clarify a poem, not to confound a reader, and that metaphors make more forceful assertions than similes. He illustrates their different effects with rewrites of the same example poem, one with metaphors and another with similes. So you get the idea. Not only does Kooser offer advice from his own deep experience with the art of poetry, but like I mentioned before, the book is full of examples from other current poets that illustrate the ideas he's presenting. One of the more interesting chapters, and in fact the last one, talks about the processes of revising, finding feedback, and sending your work out for publication. So again, it's not a book that treats poetry writing as some idealized academic thing, but it's a real-life practical process of getting ideas, crafting those ideas into poems, and then finding ways to share your work with real readers. Now, I know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but on the back cover of this book, there's a picture of our author, and come on, there's no way we're having a bad time getting poetry advice from this guy. While I love this book for all the useful information and helpful perspectives it offers, it's also just a total pleasure to read. It's like sitting down with a wise friend and having an easygoing conversation about poetry. Kooser writes in such a personable way, which is no surprise if you know his poetry, and the book is full of wisdom, humor, and an endearing simplicity that holds it all together. I mean, we can imagine the kind of pretentious nonsense ways that a poet could title a chapter about poetic form and linguistic compression, but good old Ted Kooser titled the chapter Rhyming, Ham Cubes, and Prose Poems. Again, there's no way we're having a bad time when we're using ham cubes to understand poetry. But anyway, the short of it is that the Poetry Home Repair Manual is a book that is as delightful as it is useful. Even with a degree in poetry writing, I sometimes wonder if I have any business writing it. But rereading this book with my students was such an encouraging and reassuring thing. Through this book, Kooser is not just an advocate for poetry, but an advocate for the poets, new and experienced, who are in tune with the world and eager to share their views with someone else. So I can't recommend it highly enough. And as a bonus, almost the whole first chapter is available through Google Books, so check it out for yourself if you want to see what it's all about before diving all the way in. And of course, thanks for watching. It means a lot that you'd hang out with me till the end, especially to talk about something like poetry, so keep on doing the good things that you're doing, and we'll meet again real soon.